So the Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve? It's being run by Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell is a Republican Catholic who Donald Trump says is a bigger enemy than China. So the Federal Reserve just got $500 billion to give to a bunch of big banks, to the Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. There's 12 federal banks in the Federal Reserve banks in the United States. You have the Federal Reserve Board in D.C., and you got 12 Federal Reserve banks. You have the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. So that's Federal Bank number 10. And that's Colorado. Uses Federal Reserve Bank number 10, a regional bank. But those are the only banks of the Federal Reserve. Colorado shares Federal Bank number 10 with 4 other states and 2 pieces of 2 other states. Oklahoma, Nebraska, Wyoming, Kansas, all outright use the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank, and then a piece of Missouri and a piece of northern New Mexico, a piece of West Missouri, and a piece of northern New Mexico all share Federal Bank number 10. And so therefore Federal Bank number 10 in Kansas City oversees all privately owned commercial banks in Colorado. All banks in Colorado has to give Federal Reserve Bank number 10 10% of all the deposits that they claim to have on their books. And nationally chartered commercial banks are required to hold stock in the Federal Reserve, and they can elect some of the board members of the Federal Reserve of the region. So this gives commercial banks a lot more power. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of America. It's the bank of all banks. It's the captain. It's the king of all banks of America. So wampum is not a commodity. It's just a pretty seashell back in the 1600s that the Dutch and the Native Americans used for money as a medium of exchange, as a debt, as a promissory note to pay off a debt later on. So wampum, it's not even a commodity, whereas beaver pelts and tobacco were also used as mediums of exchange. But beaver pelts and tobacco also doubled as commodities. You can use beaver pelts and tobacco. You cannot use wampum. Just a pretty seashell. But it was a pretty seashell that was used as a medium of exchange. And a medium of exchange is self-explanatory. A medium of exchange is just something that you use to exchange for something else. So, like the wampum, in order to get beaver pelts and guns and English and Dutch goods, they would exchange wampum. So they would give the Dutch wampum, they would give them English goods, they would get beaver pelts, and wampum was the medium of exchange. Instead of always having to carry all the beaver pelts at once and get the guns and Dutch wares on one setting, they could pay for the beaver pelts at one point in time and then get the guns and Dutch wares later on. So medium of exchange is what money is used for. There's 3 or 4 functions of money, and one of the function of money is that it's a medium of exchange. Now, the U.S. dollar is a world reserve currency, so therefore the world uses the U.S. dollar as a medium of exchange, and that helps our economics very much. Now, Bitcoin is a digital currency. It's not worth a continental. Commercial paper and Bitcoin. They're as worthless as a continental. They ain't worth a continental. Bitcoin is wampum. It's a cool seashell. It's a cool, neat little thing people are doing and they're trading with, but it doesn't make any goddamn sense. Chief Tadabum, he's going to get killed over wampum, over some territorial thing, but wampum was a part of. So no doubt people died over Bitcoin too. Bitcoin is now only $6,000 per Bitcoin, so it's dropped from $10,000 just a short while ago. So America, you need to pull your cash money out of the banks, dump your stocks and bonds and treasury and mortgage-backed securities right now. Protect yourself from the mortgage crunch that's about to take place. Pay 12 months in advance on your mortgage just in case all these damn banks are going to get all this damn money. Give me control of the nation's money and I care not who makes the laws. It's Mayor Amschel Rothschild. Give me control of the nation's money and I care not who makes the laws. Peter Schiff once suggested that Bernie Madoff was an expert on Ponzi schemes. He would be an expert on the U.S. economy. Since Bernie Madoff is an expert on Ponzi schemes and the U.S. economy is a Ponzi scheme, that would give an insight. Bernie Madoff would understand the U.S. economy better than a lot of other people. Peter Schiff also squeaks out economics. It's not economics to Peter Schiff. It's not, where's my money? I need to get paid. But for Peter Schiff, this is all about economics. He says it like a stuck-up, arrogant, fuck twat, professor asshole, putting on airs, pretending to know more than everybody else in the world, but actually knows way, way less. Peter Schiff believes that because of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. is on the verge of the biggest economic catastrophe in history. The Federal Reserve wasn't originally designed for buying government debt. The Federal Reserve wasn't allowed to buy U.S. treasuries. The U.S. government wasn't allowed to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. This is what Peter Schiff is saying. And he also talks about how Congress keeps on passing a debt ceiling. And they are now suspending it, not raising it, but in actuality, they're raising the debt ceiling when they suspend it. So we just keep printing up more and more money, right? Quantitative easing infinity. Now, the $2.2 trillion spending package, $250 billion is going to go to the Americans, $1,200 checks, and then $500 billion is going to go to the Fed to buy commercial paper factories and a facility to increase liquidity, corporate, whatever fucking bullshit they, unravel and announce to us, 2 months later down the road. They'll do the thing, and then they'll say they fixed it all, so that's fantastic. Jimmy Dore says they could take $500 billion for the Federal Reserve and, do a bunch of financial accounting magic tricks and turn $500 billion into $4.2 trillion. So Jill Stein's quantitative easing for student loan debt was only $1.3 trillion. They said they couldn't do it, but here we're creating $4.2 trillion in wealth through quantitative easing, just like we did in 2008. We created $3.7 trillion in wealth in 2008. The Federal Reserve right now is buying up a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and Treasury securities. So expect a mortgage, crunch. Dylan Ratigan is still pissed off, but he doesn't live in America anymore. He says the entire U.S. economic system is crazy. He says they're buying a bunch of mortgage-backed securities. They're buying Americans' assets. And the end result is going to be the kicking of millions of Americans out of their homes. They're going to foreclose them. They're getting mortgage-backed securities. And we're back in this financial institutions, these financial system, too big to fail. This too big to fail is too big to jail kind of system. That's what we're propping up for the cheese and the, and the trap. Like Thomas Massie said, Thomas Massie is 100% correct. Rand Paul was correct. The Federal Reserve, and this is from the Federal Reserve's official website, because let's stop the lollygagging around. Let's stop the horsing around. Let's get to business. Let's learn about the Federal Reserve, right? The many responsibilities of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the banker's bank. It's the U.S. government's bank. The role as a central bank for the U.S. government means that it's the king of all the banks. All the banks has to worship the Federal Reserve when the Federal Reserve marches into town. The Federal Reserve is also protected by sovereign immunity, a legal fiction which the Supreme Court continually continues to hold up. The Federal Reserve, a.k.a. the central bank of the U.S., the banker's bank, does 5 things, at least. 1, conducts the nation's monetary policy for employment, moderate long-term interest rates and stable prices, make sure the availability of money and credit is everywhere in America, also controls the interest rates, promotes equal distribution of credit, so even the poor and the homeless people can get credit too. It also fosters community development. That's number one. Number two, promotes stability. Number three, promotes individual financial institutions. Number four, mostly, promoting individual financial institutions more so than that whole equal distribution of credit thing. Fosters payments. Number four, gives services to banking industry. Fosters payments, gives services to banking industry with U.S. government, helps to facilitate U.S. dollar transactions and payments. Number five, promotes consumer protection. So, wow, fantastic. Giving services to the banking industry. They definitely always do that. Foster payments. U.S. government, facilitate transactions with the U.S. dollar. So, fantastic, right? 1913, the Federal Reserve's three responsibilities was to maximize employment, stabilize prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. So that's, short and sweet and to the point, but that, doesn't cover all those other five things that I just mentioned. Now, not surprisingly, the Federal Reserve had made the Great Depression worse. And even though they made the Great Depression worse, they expanded their centralized power. So the Federal Reserve made the Great Depression worse, and they got more powerful. So the Federal Reserve's created in 1913. 1929 is the Great Depression. Then the recession of 2008, the Federal Reserve also expanded their centralized power. Now the Federal Reserve says that they supervise and they regulate the banks, they maintain the stability of the financial system, and they provide financial services to depository institutions, the U.S. government, and foreign official institutions. So that's what the federal government or the Federal Reserve is doing now. The federal government sets the salaries of the Federal Reserve Board, seven governors, the 7 members nominated and nominated by the President, ratified by the Senate. The federal government receives all the Fed system's annual profits after a statutory dividend of 6% on member banks. Capital investment is paid, and an account surplus is maintained. In 2015, the Federal Reserve earned a net income of $100.2 billion and transferred $97.7 billion to the U.S. Treasury. So they made $3 billion themselves, but the U.S. Treasury is what made bank, right, on the Federal Reserve's net income. The U.S. Treasury basically took home the lion's share of the Federal Reserve. So, although an instrument of the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve System considers itself just living AI. They're independent. They're not going to be told to do, what to do by anybody in the whole universe. They're not going to be influenced by politics, as if that's even a possibility. They're an independent central bank. They're the U.S. government's bank, but you can't audit their books. The people aren't democratically elected. The Federal Reserve's monetary policies doesn't have to be approved by the President or anybody else in the executive or legislative branches of government. There's no accountability. Like I said, you can't audit their books. It doesn't receive funding appropriated by Congress, and the terms of the members of the Board of Governors span multiple presidents and Congress people's tenures. So Jerome Powell's picked by Donald Trump, but the other 6 members, I don't know how long they've been, part of the Federal Reserve Board. Who are these other 6 assholes that's all, dictating monetary policy for America? More purposes for the, Federal Reserve in the Federal Reserve Act. They want to furnish an elastic currency, so a dollar bill that, stretches. You could, stretch that dollar to afford means of rediscounting commercial paper. Again, with the commercial paper, that's not worth a continental. You might as well invest in Bitcoin if you're going to invest in commercial paper. To establish a more effective supervision of banking in the United States and for other purposes. So more supervision, more regulation of the banks, discounted commercial paper, elastic currency. Also, some more purposes for the Federal Reserve to serve as the central bank, right? It's the central bank for the U.S. government to help curb banking panics, to contain systemic risk in financial markets. There's boom and bust. So they just have to be, ready for the bust. Supervise, regulate the banks, protect the credit rights of consumers. So that's shocking. Maximize employment, prevent inflation and deflation, moderate long-term interest rates, manage the nation's money supply through monetary policy, help to facilitate exchange of payments among regions, helps local liquidity needs, to strengthens the U.S. standing in the world economy, to provide financial services to depositories. U.S. government foreign official institutions, including playing a major role in the nation's payments system. I think the check system is the Federal Reserve clearing the checks. It has to go through the Federal Reserve's check clearing system. So the Federal Reserve, I guess to put it simply, is to do everything and nothing. To address panics and depressions, I guess you could say that, to stop a Great Depression from ever happening again. To stop the panics is what they used to call depressions, and bank runs, where people just take all the money out of the bank and then the bank goes under. So a bank run can happen to one bank, but you got to stop, right? You can't. The 1929, apparently it was just one little thing, but nobody stopped it or did shit about it and made it worse. So they could have done something about it, and instead of the entire system collapsing. Fractional reserve banking is part of the Federal Reserve's responsibility. The banks of America have to hold at least 10% of everything that's deposited into their bank in the Federal Reserve branch bank, the original bank that represents them. So that amounts of currency and deposits in other banks equal to only a fraction, just 10% of the amount of the bank's deposits, liabilities owed to customers. So this encourages banks to invest most of their money that they get from the depositors, just like South Park. Okay, thank you for your money, and now it's gone. In fact, it's the bank's property. The bank, it's not your money. As soon as you give your money to the bank, it's not your money anymore. The bank owns it. You signed all that paperwork and all that fine print. The bank says they own your money. And then if too many of the bank's customers withdraw their deposits from a bank, since 90% of the money isn't even in the bank, then the bank can go on a bank run, and then many problems can result from a bank run. That bank will sink, but it could take other banks down with it. And then a lot of people are going to get screwed over. So banks typically invest most of their money that they get from their depositors because of the fractional reserve banking system. This is the Federal Reserve System, the Fed. When people talk about the Fed, you're talking about the system, because it's a board of governors and it's 7 federal banks and it's the central bank system. So the fractional reserve banking system encourages, the Glass-Steagall Act being repealed encourages banks to invest. They take your money, they go to a casino and they put it $1 million on red 25. And they just let it ride. Let's see what happens, right? They engage in casino-style investor kind of capitalism, try to hedge their bets and make money by, getting they got a shit ton of fucking cash, and they're going to try to take that cash and put it in mutual funds and put it into this and that and try to earn money for their stockholders and for the CEOs and for the employees. So there's many problems can result from a bank run, depressions, panics. That's probably the main point, but the fractional reserve banking system makes them, gamble like a, wild, wild west. Just, gamble on this, bet on that, bet on anything. Try to make a little bit of money here and there. Donald Trump, they said, he's a billionaire, but he would have made just as much money if he would have just put his money in a bank and let, the interest rate for the savings accrue, so he didn't have to make any decisions. He could just sat on his money and, could have earned his living that way. The Federal Reserve can possibly act as a lender of last resort when a bank run does occur. Bank run occurs, and the Federal Reserve can pump a bunch of money into that bank or let it die and pump a bunch of money into all the banks all around it. So my take on the Federal Reserve so far, I'm a little bit mixed. I'm highly suspicious and skeptical of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, it seems like they promised to do everything, and since this, 2008, 2020, this just a coronavirus collapsed our economy, they seem to be doing nothing at the same time. So they seem to be, all the responsibility in the world to do this and to do that, and maybe they're too scattered. Maybe there's no one crystal clear vision of what the Fed is actually supposed to do, supposed to help America. So if that's why Donald keeps insulting Jerome Powell to, force Jerome Powell to at least be pro-America in his decisions, in his monetary decisions, that's good for us. But the responsibilities of the Fed just goes on and on and on. Most of them, I think are kind of bullshit. Some of them, I think, they are trying to help the people, but very few of those. So community development, there's money in the Federal Reserve for community development. That's what the Federal Reserve is supposed to help develop communities. And it's also supposed to promote equal distribution of credit. So it's the monetary policy, it's the monopoly of credit, the people that own all the fucking credit and all these credit default swaps and derivatives and these hedge fund managers. That's where all this shit's come. They know they can basically play everybody off of everybody, and then when the whole thing collapses, you still got a handful of people that, did short selling, and they make a shit ton of money. So even though most of Wall Street collapses, you got another part of Wall Street that's banking on it to collapse. And in the meantime, most people don't own any stock in Wall Street, so it's weird that Wall Street collapsing would actually hurt the 80% of Americans who earn, their weekly paycheck to paycheck, their wages, 10, 20 bucks an hour, whatever. So the promoting consumer protection, promoting equal distribution of credit, developing community, all these have been, dictated as purposes once or twice before. But I think when it comes to, being over the banks, maintaining the stability, preventing depressions, I think that's like the main gist of their, ebb and flow. And they're, board, they're selected by the president, ratified by the Senate, so it's an elitist board. It's an instrument of the U.S. government, but it's also its own thing, so it doesn't listen to the American government, doesn't really do anything the American government tells them to do, which is supposed to be a good thing, but it also could be a wildly dangerous thing. I mean, what if they were, more in favor of China than America? So then they would do monetary policies, but then making a fair system to where China would be a fair, everybody should be, on equal playing ground. But, yeah, protect credit rights of consumers, maximizing employment, the long-term interest rates, moderating it, helps local liquidity needs. That's nice, helps local liquidity needs. So I don't believe most of that. It seems like the Fed is supposed to do everything and nothing at the same time. We just dictate monetary policy. We're limited in what we can do, but then they have an infinite amount of all these financial accounting magic tricks that they just pull out of their ass. Oh, well, you take $500 billion in this hand, and then you put it in that hand, and now it's $4.5 trillion. Well, how did you took $500 billion and made $4.5? How did you do that? How did you turn $500 billion and made it in? That was incredible. That's amazing. So Mayor Amschel Rothschild says, "Give me control of the nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." Peace.